Anyway, today it's kind of a fun session. I'm not introducing Josh, but I'm introducing the topic. And he came up with this idea, and I thought it was a great idea. And it's right in line with what he likes and knows a lot about. It's just going to take you through the Supreme Court in 2 hours, from beginning to present day, and do it by era and by time period as opposed to just by topic. And he came up with this concept because he's got like 10 new ideas every day of his life. And I can't keep up with all of them. But yeah, it should be fun. And
Without
okay,
further ado,
it's all yours.
Gibson said, "This has been an absolute pleasure teaching all of you. Very lively discussion. We've covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time, so I figured the only way to end this class is to cover everything else we missed, which is essentially the entire corpus of constitutional law in about 2 hours. And I hope you'll bear with me. This is going to be a little bit more of a lecture than discussion. If you do have questions, just put them up there and I'll try to get to them. But if any of you have seen the list that I put up on Angel, I spent basically a full day going through the entire U.S. reports from beginning to end, picking out all the cases that I thought were pretty important, and there are about 300 of them. And what I actually did was I plotted them chronologically, starting really from 1793 and going all the way down to 2011. And I've even included cases from this year. Why did I do this? We've discussed judicial review in this class from the very beginning. We talked about Dr. Bonham's case, where Lord Cook said that if something is nugatory to the Constitution of England, it cannot be constitutional. We talked about Marbury versus Madison, where Chief Justice Marshall asserted for the first time that the courts had this power of asserting the will of the majority. And we go to the present, like a case like Citizens United, which we talked about briefly, where there's charges of an activist court siding with corporate interests to promote some abstract concept of free speech in the face of these corrupt elections. And really, there's nothing new under the sun. Everything kind of repeats itself. And by looking at all these cases on this kind of continuum, we see it very clearly. One quote just to leave you with, to start you with. In Citizens United's dissent, Justice Stevens said, "The only relevant thing that has changed since Austin and McConnell, which were previous First Amendment cases, is the composition of this court." Now, that's where I want to start with. Is that true? Is the only thing that changes the 9 people on the court? Or is there something else? Is there something deeper, more profound that the Constitution is actually that the court's trying to accomplish? So, first I want to talk about how I divide this up. There are about 8 or 9 categories that I used. Civil rights, criminal rights, economic and property rights, employment, First Amendment, both speech and religion, federal courts, federal power, that refers to the power of the federal government to do stuff, federalism, which kind of refers to the balance between the states and the feds, and individual liberty. And at various points throughout our nation's republic, those kind of topics have kind of ebbed and flowed, almost like a sine wave, where at certain times it was very big on criminal rights, and other times it was very big on federal courts. And I want to just take you through this chronologically. Now, the first set of cases, the first period I like to talk about is really the founding of the Republic. We talk about 1793 through about 1856, which leads us up right to about the Civil War. And this was an interesting period because the Supreme Court had only been established around 1790, 1791. But originally there was nothing good happening. In fact, many people turned down appointments to the Supreme Court because no one wanted to be on it. There were no good cases. And really the first important Supreme Court common law case was Chisholm v. Georgia, which if you studied was a case where a person in Georgia sued the state of Georgia for some damages. And this more or less spawned the 11th Amendment. But this was the first time where a Supreme Court case was so important that actually people took notice of it and actually had a constitutional convention to fix or remedy what happened in Chisholm v. Georgia. But what you'll see is a lot of the early cases in the early 1800s all dealt with federal courts. What I mean by that is a jurisdiction. Before the court could actually assert itself as a body to actually make constitutional law, that actually asserted itself as a body that actually had this power. And this was really the brilliance of John Marshall. John Marshall, as we discussed at length in Marbury, basically established that the courts did have this power to assert what is and what is not constitutional. And we saw in other cases like Strawbridge v. Curtis and Ex parte Bowman, where the courts decided what kind of people can get into federal courts. Strawbridge talked about diversity jurisdiction. Ex parte Bowman actually established the Supreme Court's habeas corpus jurisdiction, that they could actually hear habeas petitions. Martins v. Hunter Lessee, this was a case that said an appeal from a state Supreme Court can actually go to the United States Supreme Court. These were all cases that kind of just laid the bare framework of how cases would make their way. In addition, the Supreme Court was very important in deciding boundary type disputes. We often think of the cases with the Indians as tragic instances of civil rights where basically these people had their land taken from them and they were just obliterated. But at its core, it was about property. It was about land. The Union wanted the land and the Indians wanted it and they were fighting for it. In the case of Johnson v. McIntosh, which was one of John Marshall's opinions, he basically said that the Indians actually were savages, and according to the laws of nature, they did not have any kind of inherent property right to this land. It was really for the white Christian people. And this was essentially a reflection of the time where the white people think they have this manifest destiny that they could take the land because they're simply better. John Marshall actually regretted that opinion. He actually publicly said, "I wish I never wrote that." And later, in the Cherokee Indian case, in one of his clashes with Andrew Jackson, he actually backed off from that and actually found ways that the Indians could protect their land. So this is a way that the courts get involved in property disputes. We also have a case like Gibbons v. Ogden, which was really a dormant commerce clause case. That was a case with the steamboats, where one guy in New York had a steamboat and someone in New Jersey. This was really a way to flesh out where the sovereigns of the state could intersect from one to the next. That the people in New Jersey couldn't tell people in New York what to do, and vice versa. That would have been, a situation. And that was one of the ways that the court asserted itself very early on. Barron v. Baltimore was another similar case that said that the Bill of Rights does not apply to the states. That's basically saying that the states are still sovereign in this sense. We have this shaping of what is federal and what is state, and there was like this fluidity for the first 40 or 50 years. But this all really came to a crashing halt when the Great Compromise collapsed. The Great Compromise being the Slavery Compromise. As you know, when the Constitution was first ratified, slavery was left in, namely because there's no way that they could possibly ratify the Constitution if slavery had been taken out, if it had been banned. But everyone at the time realized that this was on a collision course, that eventually that the court would have to confront this sooner rather than later. And this is really what I call the Republican crisis mode, from about 1857 to about 1872. This is a time when things were really, really, really dicey. It all started with, of course, Dred Scott v. Sanford. Dred Scott's an interesting case for a number of reasons, because at its core, as much as Dred Scott's about slavery, as much as it's about individual liberty, it's about diversity jurisdiction. It was essentially a civ pro case. If you actually read the opinion from the Missouri Supreme Court in Dred Scott, it has to do with diversity jurisdiction. We read in diversity that if you're a citizen of one state suing a citizen of another state, you can use federal courts. Well, citizen, hello, is a African American a citizen? And that was really the crux of the entire case. And while Taney's opinion really focused on whether a black person could be a citizen or a slave be a citizen, this or that, the entire case was whether someone could avail themselves of the federal courts. That this question we could keep addressing, can someone use the federal courts to vindicate their federal rights? This issue that keeps popping up was really the crux of Dred Scott. Dred Scott was also interesting in that Roger Taney, who was from Maryland, thought he could avert the Civil War by holding this. He wanted to prevent this armed conflict. He thought, well, if I write this opinion, it will appease the Southerners, and perhaps we'll make a state of peace, that we can have something, that maybe in the new territories, there'll be free states, but the old territories will be slavery, and we can have this kind of peace. He was trying to be a diplomat. He was trying to kind of split the difference. That failed, epically. Dred Scott was 1857, and this case set the abolitionist movement aflames. In a sense, it's a popular constitutionalism that's worse. We had a case where the Supreme Court was interpreting the Constitution and people did not agree. Abe Lincoln said, if the policy of the government upon vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by the decision of the Supreme Court, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers. He basically said that it's not just the Supreme Court's job to interpret the Constitution. And Lincoln, as I'll get to in a moment, was very big on interpreting the Constitution for himself. So we see what happens here is we have Marshall, a really smart guy, who realizes if I tell Jefferson what to do, he's going to tell me to get lost. And you have Taney, who says, hey, I'm smart, I'm going to tell the Supreme Court I'm going to tell the United States what to do, and it backfired big time. Because what happens is when the Supreme Court loses the so-called will of the people rebel. They don't like to be told what to do. So there's always this tenuous relationship between the majority will and the will of the Supreme Court, and how they have to balance it, because they have neither the power of the sword nor the purse, so they can only rely on the will of the people. So we have Dred Scott, and shortly after Dred Scott, we had a succession crisis where South Carolina, Fort Sumter, they fired upon Union troops, and that was basically the start of the Civil War. which was probably the most gruesome battle we had on this nation, and it was devastating. Now getting to the part where not just the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution, Abe Lincoln had his own view of what executive power was. You're probably familiar with the case of Ex parte Merryman, which actually wasn't a Supreme Court case. It was decided by Judge Roger Taney, sitting as a circuit justice in Maryland. And what happened was Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus. He said, I can lock you up for any reason without any check. And as you know from the Constitution, there's a suspension clause. The suspension clause says only Congress can suspend the Constitution. So we have the situation where Abe Lincoln basically said, I'm going to do this anyway, and then you have the Constitution which says you can't, and you have Roger Taney says you can't. And what did Lincoln do? Thumbed his nose at Taney, said, I don't care, I don't give a damn. We are a nation at war, we are a house divided, if I do not do this, we will fall. Keep this in mind when we get to the Bush years. Same doctrine, or very similar doctrine. So we have Abe Lincoln basically telling Roger Taney to F off. It doesn't matter what you want me to do, because I have a war fight. And that's Ex parte Merryman. We have a similar executive conflict case a few years ago, Ex parte Milligan, where this is in 1866 that basically the hostilities of the Civil War had basically ended more or less in this part of the country. I think it was in Indiana. And a general there actually wanted to try a person for some sort of military crime, even though the federal courts were operating. And in this case, the Supreme Court actually pushed back and they said, well, if the federal courts are operating, you have to try them in federal court. You can't hold a court-martial. But at the same point, the Congress didn't like this very much. So in 1869, you have Ex parte McCardle, where basically Congress tried to restrict the jurisdiction of the federal courts so they could try people in these kind of military tribunals. And then the Supreme Court said, oh, wow, they're serious about this. And they said, okay, you can do it, whatever. If you read McCardle, it's a very weak opinion. But you can read it. They're basically saying, okay, Congress, we tried to tell you what to do. You didn't like it. You win. And they kind of just push back. So there's always this give and take between the executive branches. Keep that in mind when we get to the Gitmo cases with Hamdi and Boumediene, where basically Congress told the Supreme Court to do, and the Supreme Court told them, I don't give a damn what you think. And one more case from this period, which is Texas v. White. This is actually an interesting case of whether secession is constitutional. You had some bondholders who were trying to recover money that the so-called Republic of Texas sold, and the Supreme Court basically said that Texas was never a republic and the money had to be paid. It wasn't a sovereign. So now we begin what I would like to think of as kind of like a third wave, and this is from 1873 to give or take 1932. The big deal in 1868 was the 14th Amendment. This revolutionized the way constitutional law works. This changed the ballgame. We talked about the early years with federalism, with Barron v. Baltimore, McCulloch, and all these other cases. What exactly is the relation between the feds and the states? We have the 14th Amendment now. That changed the deal. And there were a couple of big cases that relied on the 14th Amendment. Well, let's just put this in a historical backdrop. We're in 1868. Reconstruction. The radical Republicans are running Congress. The southern states are basically in a state of shambles. And more or less as a condition of their reentry to the Union, the northern states basically twisted their arms that if you don't ratify the 14th Amendment, you can't come back in the Union. So it's questionable. I mean, as a matter of ethically, is the 14th Amendment valid in that sense? I mean, the southern states, they didn't agree to it, and even if the people representing the states agreed to it, they weren't properly elected. There were no fair elections. It was kind of just a ramshot way of getting this thing approved, but approved they did. And we now have the 14th Amendment. Now, what happens with the 14th Amendment is the Supreme Court doesn't quite like it right away, and it's very contentious. Even though the 14th Amendment was supposed to revolutionize this federal-state relationship, the court was very resistant to this change, perhaps reflecting the fact that not all the country agreed with this, that there were so many people, especially in the South, who weren't big fans of this new federalism, so to speak. So I take you first to the 1873 up here, which is the slaughterhouse cases, which you should be familiar with if you followed common law recently. But this was a case based out of New Orleans, where New Orleans opened up New Orleans passed a law saying if you want to slaughter beef or any animal, any livestock in city limits, you have to do it in this one place. You can't open up your own slaughterhouse. A bunch of butchers in New Orleans didn't like it. They said, well, that one butcher is basically a favored by the government, they're getting all this business, and I want to have my own way to slaughter animals. So they actually brought suit under the 14th Amendment and the Privileges or Immunities Clause, saying that one of the privileges or immunities of citizenship is liberty of contract, the right to freedom of contract. If I want to open my own slaughterhouse, and I should be able to do it. This was one of the first cases interpreting the 14th Amendment. And the Supreme Court, in an opinion that almost everyone agrees is wrong, any historian, left, right, or center, agrees that this case was wrong, said that the 14th Amendment and the Privileges and Immunities Clause means nothing. It's basically just protection of certain federal rights, but it doesn't transform this relationship. That was a 5-4 case with a very vigorous dissent. And you see that even 1873, 5 years after the 14th Amendment, we see this pushback, this resistance to this change, because the Supreme Court wasn't quite there yet. We have a case you probably never heard of, but was one of the first women's rights cases in 1875, Minor v. Happersett. People said, well, there's an equal protection clause. I'm a woman. I can't vote. Why can't I vote? This is one of the first abolitionist cases. The Supreme Court, for whatever it was worth, said women cannot vote, that the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause is thus limited. This was, of course, reversed by the 19th Amendment, which gave women suffrage. But we have, again, a case where the Supreme Court wasn't quite ready for this expansion of rights. We have Cruikshank, an early case which was part of the Colfax Massacre, which was actually a really sad case where basically a white lynch mob shot up a bunch of black guys in somewhere in the South. It was really a sad case. And the Supreme Court basically said that certain federal rights cannot be applied to the states, and there was nothing they could do about it. And we have this pushback even more. We have the civil rights cases where we have places of public accommodation wanted to exclude black people. In this case, the Supreme Court said, well, that's unconstitutional, violates protection. We have this kind of uneasy relationship going forward. We have Wickard V Hopkins, and we have the exclusionary cases where the Supreme Court actually upheld the exclusion of Chinese Americans from the United States on the basis that they were foreign. So we have these great things like due process, equal protection, all these buzzwords that don't really mean anything yet for the later part of the 19th century. And then we're progressing, and against this entire backdrop, keep in mind historically the progressive movement is rising, the Grange, all these sentiments to give power to the people, William Jennings Bryan, bimetallurgy, all these different things are kind of ruminating. The expansion of these big trusts and these big corporations, the industrialization of America, moving away from the farms and moving to the inner city. All these kind of things are kind of brewing in the background at the same time. And then we get to more or less the turn of the century.
Can I just, one interesting thing that jumps out, and perhaps you can cover very briefly, is there were no criminal rights cases listed in here until around 1880 in that area. Can you explain that?
Actually, there was one, Calder v. Bull in 1798. Everyone knows about the ex post facto law, right? There was actually a criminal case in 1798 where a state actually tried to pass a law criminalizing something after the fact, which is an ex post facto law. That was basically the first criminal law case in the Supreme Court. But the main reason why there were no criminal law cases is because there was no federal criminal law that applied to the states. None of the Bill of Rights had been incorporated yet. And even more so, the Supreme Court had a discretionary appellate jurisdiction, so there was no means by which they could even appeal from a state Supreme Court for a criminal conviction. It just didn't exist. So we don't even have, if you look at this list, criminal cases until really the 1880s, which was actually slightly even the first one I can see was 1880 was Strata versus West Virginia, which wasn't really criminal. It was really just an early instance of Batson, where a guy was basically convicted in which all the black jurors were excluded. He said, wow, this jury wasn't fair. And the court actually found that that could be a violation of equal protection. So it was somewhat criminal, but it was really based on the 14th Amendment. I mean, it's a broader picture that a lot of the things that we consider, First Amendment, Second Amendment, whatever, was really viewed as this broad conception of liberty within the 14th Amendment. So we move to, let's see, we got to do 1896, and we have Plessy versus Ferguson. So this is about 30 years after the ratification of the 14th Amendment. And you have Homer Plessy, who was actually, I think, 1/16th or 1/32nd black. He actually wasn't, he didn't even look black if you look at the photographs of him. He was, he had only a very distant relative, I think. And this was basically a setup. He knew what he was doing. He walked onto a white car, a white train car on the train, because he wanted to have this as a set case. And you actually have, what's interesting is Ferguson was actually the name of the judge in Louisiana. I still don't know why it was captioned like that, but I think the guy's name was something Ferguson. And this was a very, I actually have, if you go to here, I have a link to it. You can get the link from there, but I linked to an angel. I have pictures of a lot of these cases, and I'm not going to have time to click through all of them. But I think I have a picture of Plessy and Ferguson. Hold on. And if I don't, then I don't. But I do. I don't know.
He passed it, Josh.
Where is it?
One more, I think. Right
Here we go. Here we go. Yeah, this is actually a plaque somewhere in Louisiana to commemorate Homer Plessy. I think I have a picture of him. Yeah, this is Judge Ferguson. That's what the guy looked like. Huge mustache. And you have Plessy versus Ferguson, where 30 years after the ratification of the 14th Amendment, equal protection, we still have a case that found that on public train accommodations that the state could actually enforce segregation. Noted there was a very notorious dissent in Plessy from one John Marshall Harlan, who's one of my personal icons. Judge Gibson, turn yourself enough in class. So this was Mr. Ferguson, and he had this opinion, and it was very controversial. And this really set the stage for and permitted Jim Crow. And in a sense, this basically reflected what a lot of people wanted at the time, because a lot of people in the United States weren't quite comfortable. They were comfortable with freeing the slaves, but they still had this ingrained sense of inferiority that the Supreme Court kind of just permitted. So let's go ahead to that 1900. And I mentioned before the backdrop of when these cases were going on. There was this booming industrialization, and there was this broad progressive movement. And when I say progressive, that's a term people don't necessarily understand, but it was this notion that the state or the federal government should be responsible for protecting the well-being of individuals, that the individual is not able to care for himself. So they would promote things like health standards, labor laws. You can only work so many hours a week, minimum wages. These are all progressive laws that more or less translate to the modern-day Democratic Party, more or less with some exceptions. And we come to a case that really, or a doctrine that really didn't gel well with progressivism, which is what you might have heard of as economic substantive due process, or Lochnerism, or you might have even heard of it as liberty of contract. I don't want to get into it too deeply, but one thing just to stress is that, and one thing I want to dispel from you, is that the doctrine of economic due process wasn't invented by the Lochner Court. In fact, since the onset of the 14th Amendment, you actually had a series of cases that actually developed this doctrine. If you look over here, we have a number of cases leading up to Lochner in 1905, which helped develop this doctrine. Now, let's just go back. The 14th Amendment, which speaks broadly in terms of liberty, included a lot of different types of liberty, one of which was life, liberty, and property. One of the liberties, as understood in 1868, was actually economic rights. Remember, we had the butchers and the slaughterhouse cases. They said, well, I have the right to earn an honest living, and you can't prevent me from doing that unless you give me a good enough reason. You can't prevent me from building a slaughterhouse in the city of New Orleans. This was really the doctrine of liberty of contract. And we had this doctrine developing for years. We have, for example, Munn v. Illinois, which was a case that I think Illinois put a maximum rate on a grain elevator. And there's a question whether that violated someone's right to contract. We have a case like Mueller, Chicago being a couple others. Mueller, Oregon, which was a law that said women could not work more than a certain number of hours per week. We have all these cases where people are putting restrictions on a person's economic liberties. And Lochner v. New York, which I'll talk about in a minute in detail, was really, for whatever reason, became the most famous of these cases. I know I picked up Lochner right here. I don't. Anyway, here we go. Actually, I discovered this picture in the archives in upstate New York. I think the first person to actually find this picture. It's actually pretty cool. Joseph Lochner owned a bakery in Utica, New York. We pride ourselves on uniformity, purity, and cleanliness. I actually sold prints of these for a while. It's kind of cool. Lochner in New York was a baker. He was actually an immigrant. I think he came from Germany, who basically employed a bunch of immigrants as baker. And in order to compete with a lot of the entrenched bakers who had machinery and all this elaborate equipment, he had to have his bakers work more than 60 hours a week. These weren't people who were being forced to work. They actually wanted to work. They needed the hours, and they were immigrants who had no money, and they needed to thrive. Lochner had an uneasy relationship with the local union, unsurprisingly, and for years they've been trying to shut him down, frankly, because they didn't want him working there. They didn't want him competing, because if you have one baker that's limited to 40 hours a week, one baker that can work 80 hours a week, this other baker is going to be more effective, and this is not uncommon, but people try to use the government to try to restrict their competition. And that was really the grounding of this case. And here's actually a newspaper clipping from some point. We have one more picture. This is actually an ad I found for hot cross buns from Lochner's Bakery in an old newspaper. It's kind of cool. So anyway, so we have Lochner. Yeah, it's that time of the year, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I can't eat bread now, so I'm just going to shut up. So we have Lochner, and Lochner went to the Supreme Court, and the question was whether there's a right of liberty of contract, whether there's something that prevents a state from limiting the number of hours. If I want to work 75 hours a week, I should be able to. And the majority opinion by Justice Rufus Peckham said that yes, there is such a thing called liberty of contract, and the state hasn't shown that it's harmful enough to a person's health and well-being to limit them. The most famous dissent, which you're probably familiar with, is from Justice Holmes, who said that this opinion, social Darwinism, that the 14th Amendment does not enact Mr. Herbert Spencer's social status, which was mostly just rhetoric. The only social Darwinist in the court was Holmes, because he actually upheld forced sterilization in Buck v. Bell. Majority opinion was not about social Darwinism, it was about liberty of contract, which was his doctrine. The dissent, which was probably more reasonable, was Justice Harlan, who actually said that yes, this liberty of contract exists, but the state also has an interest in protecting the health and welfare of people, so we feel to regulate this. For better or worse, Lochner was really uneventful at the time. It wasn't that big of a deal. It only became a much bigger deal later when we looked at a lot of the later cases. The year after Lochner, in 1906, we have, let's see, we have the case of Mueller v. Oregon. I think I have some pictures for that one. Mueller v. Oregon was a similar case, which I think Oregon passed a law limiting the number of hours a week women could work. Not men, just women. And this, oh, here we go. It was actually a laundry house somewhere in Oregon, and actually they passed a law saying that women could not work a certain number of hours per week. And this was actually one of the first women's rights cases, because a lot of the people, women were saying, hey, this is paternalistic. How can a man tell me I can't work as many hours as a man? That's actually kind of a form of gender discrimination. The Supreme Court actually struck that down, not on equal protection grounds, but liberty of contract, saying if a woman wants to work this many hours, they should be able to. This is actually the laundromat in Oregon where the women work. And this is actually a picture of how the women worked in that laundry house. So we actually have this developing doctrine of economic liberty that really came to a head in the 1930s, but I'll get there in a minute. So let's go back to the general list. And I hope you're just seeing now how, viewing all these cases in this historical context, kind of everything fits together, that you might have studied some of these cases in one class, and other cases in a different class. I'm just trying to bring it all together. All right, so I just covered the first 100 years. Let's keep going. So now we're at let's just go to 1908. Everyone remember Motley Rule, federal courts, of what is the proper way to plead a complaint? This was also a part of the times, because this goes back to the question of how are federal courts going to be able to adjudicate claims? Because remember the facts of Motley. You have Mr. and Mr. Motley who were injured by a railroad and they want their remedy. Can they go to federal court? You have this big, massive corporation, giving the shaft to little Mr. and Mrs. Motley, and will the court be able to vindicate those rights? Same question over and over again.
I apologize. We've got something going on with the U.S. Attorney that I had to keep monitoring, so it wasn't a personal.
Was it a situation?
I won't go there, Josh, because you'll get this in Jersey Shore, and I don't want to go there.
I'm actually developing a law here on Jersey Shore, but yeah, there's actually Oklahoma University is teaching a class in Jersey Shore. I'm trying to get a guest lecture there. So let's go on to 1908.
You remember Mr. Valcosi? That's who I was just talking about.
Remember 1908, Ex parte Young, another similar case. I mentioned before Chisholm v. Georgia in the 11th Amendment, which was a case that said in Chisholm v. Georgia, a person in Georgia was allowed to sue their state. 11th Amendment responds because it said a person cannot sue the state they live in. That's what the 11th Amendment says. But there was a previous case in the 1890s, of 1890, right, the Hans v. Louisiana, where the Supreme Court interpreted the 11th Amendment in a bizarre fashion. Even though the text says you cannot sue the state where you live, they read it to mean you cannot sue any state. They basically ignored the text of the Constitution. And this created an odd situation where if a state violated someone's rights, there's nothing you can hold them against them. You can't sue the state. So you go from 1890 to 1908, that's about, 18 years? I can't do math. So about 18 years. And the court kind of backtracked. It said, well, you can't sue the state, but you can sue the officer of a state. They created this legal fiction. They said, when a person who works for the state, perhaps a director of a state agency, is violating the Constitution, effectively they're not working for the state anymore. They don't get the protection. Even though that same defense in 1983 context won't apply, because they're still closed with the third law, but neither here nor there. So we see this balancing between going back and forth. Let's go ahead to 1908. So 1908 we also have Twining versus New Jersey, which was a criminal rights case. This is actually one of the first cases that considers whether the criminal procedure protection of the Bill of Rights applied to the states. We are now 50 years after the ratification of the 14th Amendment, and we're just now trying to see if these criminal rights can apply to the states. We have Twining, and we have Weeks, which was basically the exclusionary rule. I think it was actually the exclusionary rule applied to the federal government, whether evidence in violation of the 14th Amendment will be excluded. And this is all kind of happening in the same period. So we have 1916, we have, what case? American Well Works. This is Justice Holmes's view of federal question jurisdiction. So we also have only, from Ex parte Young to American Well Works, we have about 8 years, which is the same kind of motion. We're trying to make the courts more open. Well, Ex parte Young allow you to sue federal officials in state court for prospective relief, and now we have American Well Works, which has broadened the federal question jurisdiction. And if we keep going, we have, now we get to the mid-1900s, like 1919, 1919. What was happening in the world like in 1917, 1918, 1919? There was this big World War I, yes. And it's very common, as we saw in the Civil War, that stuff happening in war comes back to the courts. It always happens. It's like almost like the point of last refuge. And what very frequently happened during the World War I is you had these laws passed which were meant to prevent and punish certain types of speech that they consider seditious or treasonous. And you have Abrams and Schenck, I always forget which is which, but they basically considered different laws that restricted speech that were really contrary to the war effort. And you have to remember the context. 1919 was so raging in World War I, people are dying. And the Supreme Court upheld these restrictions on speech more or less because we're in a time of war. And if you look at the entire list before us, there have been no First Amendment cases because we really didn't have that kind of free speech. In the Schenck case, if I'm remembering correctly, was Justice Holmes' famous dissent, where he said, you cannot restrict speech unless it's a clear and present danger, the shouted fire in the theater. But that's where it came from. That wasn't dissent. That was not a majority. It wasn't adopted until much later, when the war was over. So let's keep going. We have Pennsylvania Colby Mahon, which is 1922, another Justice Holmes opinion right there, which effectively created the the regulatory taking doctrine, where I think the state of Pennsylvania put a limitation on someone's mineral rights underneath their surface, so there was no actual taking of the property, but there was something infringing on their property rights, and that was a very broad opinion from Justice Holmes. Another case, Village of Euclid v. Ambler, around the same period involving economic rights, that upheld the idea of zoning. I mean, if you think about it, every time your property is zoned, they're limiting the value of your property. If you can't build something that you want to build there, your property is worthless. Not worthless, but worth less. And a lot of people thought that was actually a form of taking, that they're taking your property. Village of Euclid actually permitted this. And what's happening in the background? We have basically this mass exodus from the cities with the invention of the automobile and the Model T, people going to the suburbs. And we have all these cute little communities that want to zone their places and make all their little things line up very nicely. And this was something that the court was considering of, can cities do this? This mass exodus from the city. We come back to 1922, 23, we have Bailey v. Drexel, and Atkins v. Children's Hospital. Those are kind of economic cases. Bailey, I think, struck down a child labor law. Atkins was also another law restricting wages. So we see this kind of pushback. Two cases which I hope you've heard of, but you might not have, is Meyer v. Nebraska and Pierce v. Society of Sisters. Anyone ever hear either of those? Meyer v. Nebraska, I don't think I have a picture of that one, dealt with the right of schools to teach any languages. This was in the 1920s, so in the aftermath of World War I, there was a huge anti-German phobia in the United States. They renamed sauerkraut Liberty cabbages. They started killing dachshunds, which I hate because I have a dachshund. There was this massive anti-German phobia in the United States. And a lot of schools banned the teaching of German. And this case was basically about the way that we can force students to learn whether parents had a liberty interest in seeing that their students learn a certain language, whether schools could limit that. Pierce v. Society of Sisters was a case that would make many teacher unions today proud, where the state of Oregon, I think, banned private schools effectively. Now, on the surface, I said, we're doing this because we want to make sure students receive proper educations. The real reason why is they want to ban Catholic schools. This was basically anti-Catholicism, because most of the private schools were actually Catholic. And the Supreme Court said, parents have a strong liberty interest in protecting the welfare and the safety and the education of their children, that they can direct the upbringing of their kids. Let's connect, and they're not often connected, but I'm going to connect it. 1905, Lochner, we have Pierce and Meyer. They're all based on the same idea that you have the individual liberty to do with yourself as you wish. These are all part of the same doctrines. And if you go ahead to Griswold v. Connecticut, which was a contraception case in Roe v. Wade, they actually relied on Myers v. Nebraska and Pierce v. Society of Sisters for this idea that you can direct your own body and direct your own family. They didn't cite Lochner because they didn't really like economic rights. And we'll get to that in 1914 Caroline products. So you see, all this kind of plays together very well. So we have 1926, 1927. 1927 was Whitney v. California's a free speech case, where Justice Brandeis wrote one of the most eloquent defenses of free speech ever, which wasn't quite ready for the mainstream, but it would eventually come to the fore. We have Buck v. Bell, 1927. This is a horrible case. The Nazis perfected eugenics, the United States really invented it. In the early progressive movement, those people were so fond of minimum wage laws and maximum hour laws, they also had the idea of let's sterilize retarded people. Let's sterilize people who are mentally handicapped. That way they can't breed and we don't have to deal with them. The same reasoning that says a person can't work a number of hours leads to the conclusion that we can tell people what kind of lives they can live and who even can live. It's really a perverted culture, and I mentioned before, the only social Darwinist in the court was Oliver Holmes. In this case of Buck v. Bell, you had Carrie Buck, or was it Carrie Bell? I always forget which is which, because they're both B's. We had this girl named Carrie who had a very low IQ. I don't think it was ever actually tested in any formal sense, but apparently she wasn't very smart. And the state basically wanted to sterilize her. And Justice Holmes, in his infinite wisdom, said that this is okay, that this is within the power of the state to protect the health, safety, and welfare of people. We don't need people on the poor roll. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Disgusting. For what it's worth, Buck v. Bell has never been overturned, and was actually cited favorably in Roe v. Wade for the proposition that the state can restrict access to certain procedures. Throwing that out there. So we have Buck v. Bell in 1927. Olmsted v. U.S. was one of the Fourth Amendment cases which you probably learned about that was overturned. Historically, criminal procedure worked in a way that you only had a Fourth Amendment violation when you actually intruded on someone's property. So if I reached over, I reached into his window, that was a Fourth Amendment violation. But if I leaned up and listened against his window and made no physical entry, you're cool. In Olmsted, the actual question was whether you could, I think it was some sort of drill. So they drilled in someone's house with a listening device, and that's actually a physical intrusion. But in the absence of such an intrusion, there's no Fourth Amendment violation. That was overturned about 40 years later in Katz v. United States, which we studied as a phone booth case. But that was in 1928. All right, so let's go to 1934. Okay. You probably learned a lot about the 1930s in the Supreme Court, but let's try this a little bit different. The United States was in depression. People were very upset. President Roosevelt was elected to help, save the nation. And even before Roosevelt started his New Deal program, there have been a lot of people grumbling, saying that the Constitution doesn't permit this assertion of power. I mean, even FDR admitted that what I'm doing is not in the Constitution. We have to basically rewrite the Constitution without rewriting it. He considered amending it, but decided against it. He probably should have, for his sake. So let's just do a couple of these cases, which you might not have studied. Home Building Loan v. Blaisdell. This was a case that might sound somewhat familiar, but there was a housing crisis where people started foreclosing on their mortgages. Nothing's new. Where people were underwater and they couldn't afford their mortgages because there were high interest rates in the 30s, and they went belly up. And I think it was it New York? No, I think it was in Minnesota actually. Passed a law basically providing relief from foreclosure, saying banks could not foreclose on mortgages. Sound familiar? And unsurprisingly, bankers said, hey, what the heck? We have these mortgages, they didn't pay, we have to foreclose. And the Supreme Court, in a kind of nebulous opinion, said, well, generally you're right, but we're in a time of crisis now. Things are really bad. Who is John Galt? Things are just going downhill. So they said in this time we're going to basically ignore the Constitution. Remember before you had Tawney say, well, I'm going to stick it to him because the Constitution says something. And this court, perhaps more sensitive at the time, said we're not going to, we'll allow it. 1935, the gold clause cases. You might not even know about this, but at one point, if you had a gold bullion, you could walk into any Federal Reserve of the United States and actually get cash for it. Gold was actually considered a form of legal tender. And as you probably know, FDR took us off the gold standard, basically put us on a paper money standard. The only problem was that all these people who had all these gold coins that had stamped legal tender, that actually had value, and probably the largest taking following the Emancipation Proclamation, FDR basically said that those bills are worthless. You have to hand them in to the United States, and you're not going to, we'll pay for them, but you can't keep them. It was a huge, massive taking. Far below fair market value because FDR in his Keynesian wisdom was inflating the monetary supply, so the only thing working was this gold. You had to get rid of it. So we...
This has nothing to do with the law itself, but what I find interesting, it's just something... You have Tawney in 1857, and you have Holmes on the court until what year?
1920s, 1928, something like that.
Late 20s.
Yeah.
Holmes actually was a Union officer in the Civil War, and he's still a factor in American history, deciding Supreme Court cases into the late 1920s. And this guy fought and was wounded and was kind of a hero in the Civil War as a Union officer. I just think that's fascinating that he would span that.
Yeah, he lived to be 90-something.
To participate in the Civil War and still be deciding cases just before FDR is elected. That's pretty interesting.
Teddy Roosevelt appointed him that regretted it. He once said about Holmes, I could have carved a banana with more backbone than Holmes. He didn't like him. So let's go to the gold clause case where it was before. You actually had a case where the government is basically taking away people's private gold. And this was obviously a taking. Everyone knew it. And the Supreme Court was confronted with something. It said, well, if we find this to be a taking, he's going to do it anyway. Because FDR said, I don't care what the Supreme Court does. Like Lincoln, I'm going to do it. So in a very nebulous opinion that really makes no sense, you can read it. The Supreme Court says, well, yeah, it's a taking, but it's okay here. There's no legal reasoning. So we have this case. We have the gold clause cases. And we have Blaisdell, where the court was saying, no mas, all right, you win. But they still push back a little bit on other aspects. They realized they weren't going to win the property. They weren't going to win the gold. They weren't going to win the mortgages. But in Schechter Poultry versus United States, I think I have pictures for that one. Okay, the Schechter brothers were these Jewish butchers in New York who basically ran a butcher somewhere in Brooklyn. I don't think I have it here. If anyone finds it, just tell me. So basically they ran a butcher in Brooklyn. And as part of President Roosevelt's NRA, not the National Rifle Association, but the National Recovery Act, he passed all these cumbersome health codes that said you have to have this many chickens, you have to weigh this much. It was very difficult to comply with. And these brothers said, we can't do this. We're a kosher butcher. It would be too difficult for us to comply. Amity Schleis is a great book and a great survey of this called The Forgotten Man. I highly recommend it. And they basically challenged this National Recovery Act as a violation of the Commerce Clause, saying, listen, we're just selling chicken here. You know, we're not engaging in interstate commerce. Alternatively, they said there's also a non-delegation doctrine here. The delegation doctrine basically says that the Congress cannot delegate to the executive branch certain lawmaking functions. But what actually happened was Congress gave this NRA, this agency, the ability to write all these laws and regulations. And basically they delegated the legislative power to the executive branch. And that's really a separation of powers issue. The Supreme Court, in a striking case in Schechter Poultry, struck down this law. They said this is unconstitutional. And this sent FDR scrambling. He was freaking out because the NRA was really the cornerstone of his recovery plan. And this was 1935. And this was a really, really controversial case at the time. The brothers were thrilled. If you actually look at the, there's this really cool picture of the brothers standing there, like, that's on the Supreme Court, like, yes, this is a great picture. It was in time, which is probably why I don't have it. So we have Schechter Poultry. Humphrey's executors in the United States, you might not know about, involved removal power. FDR basically wanted to remove someone from office without any cause, and the question was whether you could do it. And the court kind of said, you can. Okay, so we're going to get to the war cases in a bit. We're not quite there yet. So let's do NLRB v. Jones and Laughlin. This was a case that really preceded Wickard v. Filburn, where the court basically said that almost anything can be considered interstate commerce. Anything involving business was interstate commerce, and this basically was repudiation. The biggie, though, in 1937, I'll just do this one, Talcott v. Connecticut, this was also an incorporation case where the court started flirting with the idea of incorporating provisions of the Bill of Rights into the states. But the key one here is West Coast Hotel v. Parish, and you might have heard the expression, the switch in time that saved 9, which is not entirely accurate, but I'll just give you the history. Leading up to 1937, the Supreme Court and the FDR was basically in this struck of this death match. They didn't like each other. And FDR had this brilliant court packing proposal saying any justice over the age of 65, I can appoint a new one. So you'll basically stack the court. As you probably know, the Constitution doesn't prescribe a size for the Supreme Court. In fact, at one point in the 1800s, we actually had 10 justices. It was kind of a fluke. So there's nothing saying you can only have 9 justices. In fact, our first Supreme Court was like 3 or 4. I think the vote in Marbury v. Madison was like 3 to 1 or something. Or I think it was 3-zip. So FDR wanted to pack the court. And the justices more or less realized that if we don't vote this way, we'll probably be in trouble. So the justice who really switched his vote was Justice Owen Robert, who had voted with what were called the Four Horsemen, the people who voted kind of against FDR's programs, and he basically switched his vote. West Coast Hotel v. Parish, I think I have a picture of that somewhere. One of these are alphabetized. But, oh, here we go. This is the, this is actually the hotel, what the heck it's called? This is actually the hotel in Wanakee, Washington, where Mrs. Parrish worked. Her name was Elsie Parrish. She was a launderer. She washed sheets and stuff. And this was a case involving an economic liberty case where I think it was either a maximum hour law or a minimum wage law. I don't remember which one it was. And the court basically said, okay, you know what, no mas. You know, economic liberty, we're willing to sacrifice it. So they kind of just backed off. This was actually the hotel. This picture was taken a few years ago, but they made it black and white to look old. You'll see the cars are pretty modern. So then we have 1937.
That's the way out front.
And then we have 1938, one of my, oh, I forgot it. United States v. Caroline Products. This was a filled milk case involving a law that said, oh, here we go. I have a picture of the Caroline Products factory also. This is also a modern picture, which I made black and white to look older. But this is actually the Litchfield Creamery in Illinois somewhere for Caroline Products. And there's something called filled milk, where instead of using actual milk, you use some sort of like corn something or other, to make fake milk, basically. It's condensed milk. And a lot of the dairy interests don't like this, because now you have this product that can be stored in a can. It's good forever, it tastes like milk. So rather than competing in the marketplace, they captured the government and they made them basically pass a law banning their competition, which is a brilliant way to compete. So they basically banned the production of this filled milk, this product. And the case wasn't too important on the merits, because at that point, for a number of years, they had the idea that the government could do whatever they want, following Wickard, which comes next. But in this case, there was a very famous footnote, which was footnote 4 of Caroline Products, where Justice Stone basically bifurcated our rights. He said, there are certain rights we like, and there are certain rights we don't like. There are certain rights in the Bill of Rights and other rights that affect discrete and insular minorities, which should be given very strong judicial protection. And there are other rights, like economic rights or the rights of liberty of contract, which are not quite as important. And he effectively cut rights in half. It was an arbitrary distinction, but it's a distinction that stuck. So these other kind of rights get what we now know as strict scrutiny. These other rights get what we now know as rational basis. Footnote 4 in Caroline Products back in 1938 was really the progenitor of all this tiers of scrutiny. Those terms didn't quite come into play until the 50s or so, but that's really where it all began. And in a case, we're still in 1938, but we have Erie Railroad v. Tompkins. Everyone remember Erie? The case with the dude near Wilkesboro walking along the train tracks. I even have pictures of it. And these are actually from the right time. I found the Wilkesboro Historical Society. These are actually the tracks, not where he was injured, but close enough. So this is what it looked like. So you had a guy walking somewhere like this dude, walking along the right of way, and you had the Erie Railroad, had like a thing sticking out, and it clubbed him, and he got injured. And the question was, when you sue in federal court, which law applies? The law of the state or some sort of federal common law? And as you well know, in this case, in Erie Railroad, they said that there is no federal common law, that a federal court sitting in diversity applies the law of the state where it sits. What you might not have realized, though, is that this was set against the backdrop of 1938. that you have all this other stuff going on at the same time, all this centralization of federal power, and now you have this way of federal courts are opening up even more to allow more types of claims to come in, because this federal common law was quite conservative and wasn't very permissive. Now you have all this progressive law in the states can now be applied in the federal courts. It was a brilliant move. Also in 1938 was the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. Before this, we had basically something called form pleading or common law pleading. You know, the federal rules, the courts basically centralized how we're doing pleading. So the entire 1930s is like this entire like vortex swirling to Washington, where it's just sucking everything in. And you usually study Erie and Cipro, you'll study that in common law and that in fed courts. It was all going on at the exact same time. Hague v. CIO was interesting. It was one of the first freedom of association cases, but which allowed people to congregate as they wished, but involved a CIO, which was a Congress of Industrial Organization, it was a labor union, which was also kind of tying back in. So it wasn't just freedom of association, it was a certain type of freedom of association. All right, so now we get Wickard v. Filburn, which is a case very relevant. I don't have the pictures of him here because I have to pay Time Magazine for them. They want a lot of money, so I will not do that. But yeah, Fred Filburn was a farmer in Ohio. Currently, his farm has a shopping mall built on top of it that shut down a couple of years. So you have Wickard v. Filburn, and there was a law, the National Economic Farm something or other, doesn't really matter the name of it, and they passed a law basically saying that you cannot produce more than a certain amount of wheat. You're limited how much wheat you can produce. So Wickard said, all right, I'm not going to sell this wheat. I'm going to produce this extra wheat. I'm going to eat it myself and feed it to my animals. And it's not going out of my farm, it's staying in my farm. The Supreme Court basically said that's interstate commerce, that even if you have something which is totally on your farm, it's still affecting the market in the aggregate, because if you're not selling that wheat, if you're making the wheat yourself, you don't have to buy it somewhere else. If you're not buying it somewhere else, that affects the market. Whatever. If you explain that to non-lawyers, they laugh, and there's a good reason why. But that was the law for a number of years, and probably still is the law. We can go ahead to 2006 with Gonzales v. Raich, was a medicinal marijuana case, where if I grow pot on my farm and I don't sell it, you know, is that affecting a market? And the Supreme Court said yes. They said if you grow marijuana yourself, you're not buying marijuana in the market. And if you're not buying marijuana in the market, you're affecting a national market. What marijuana market exists? Legal market? I don't quite know, but you can ask Justice Stevens about that.
Multi-billion-dollar market.
Oh, damn straight. Legal market. So we have, and going back to this case, we have actually in 1940, in addition to Hague v. CIO, we have minors v. Gogobitis. So we have this, keep in mind, we're right now in the midst, we're leading up to World War II. World War II is about a year away. So we have Gogobitis, which is a case for a bunch of Jehovah's Witness kids. They didn't want to say the Pledge of Allegiance. They didn't want to. They didn't want to salute. It goes against the doctrines of their faith. And the court basically said that it doesn't matter, that you're patriotic and you're an American, you're going to salute the flag. That was reversed about 10 years later in the one other case. I forgot which one it was. I'll get to it in a second. So now we have 1942, and now we're in World War II, and we'll go through the war cases a little bit together. We have Ex parte Quirin, which was a Nazi saboteurs case, which was kind of a weird case. You had these Nazis that were basically washed ashore somewhere in Florida, and their intent was to infiltrate the United States and kind of sabotage the United States. It wasn't a very smart plan, and they actually surrendered. And actually, I read an article about this recently. One of them walked into a police office and said, "Get me J. Edgar Hoover," and like he wanted to basically like plead out. So that didn't work out too well. But they were basically tried, and that was Ex parte Quirin, which is one of the cases that can rely on the Gitmo cases to see how do you try an enemy combatant or a prisoner of war in the United States. That's Ex parte Quirin. Chaplinsky is a fighting words doctrine. If I say something so bad that you're going to punch me in the face, it's unprotected speech. That was one of the first important free speech cases. All right, so let's go to what I think is really the next tier of cases, which really begins in the 1940s. And these are really cases that reflect the time. So you've all heard of Korematsu, which was in 1944. That was a case where FDR basically issued an executive order saying all people of Japanese American descent on the West Coast are going to be locked up in a concentration camp, or internment camp, whatever you want to call it. And the Supreme Court said, yep, yeah, FDR, you can do that, that's cool. Also, probably like 8 of the 9 justices had been appointed by Roosevelt at that point, so it was kind of a stacked deck. I think Korematsu was 9-zip, I'm pretty sure, which was a shame.
Josh, it was actually 3 dissents.
Oh, thank you. Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
so it was, but it wasn't close.
Well, no,
yeah.
and actually the dissents they were not exactly strong dissents, because they said things like, well, we're not saying we would have stopped the military from doing what they were doing, it's just that it is unconstitutional now.
Yeah,
So
and,
they're
yeah,
kind
and,
of like-
thanks for correcting me. There was not